up, peeps? Welcome to a training episode with Dylan Duke. We used to call this Chilling with Dylan on all my other podcasts. I'm trying to come up with a catchy name for how we're going to roll these out on the training side of things. But what we're doing today is going to be walking through the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. So for those of you who work as a licensee in the state of Georgia, this is going to be a very important form for you because this is what we use in order to establish a client relationship with a buyer. Now, in today's world, we really need to make sure that we're getting something signed ahead of time before we actually go out and start showing property with our buyers. And so you have three different options for forms as to how you can do that. The first being this one, the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, which is the one that we always want to strive for. This gives us that client relationship where we can do all the things with our buyer. We can write the documents, we can show the property, we can give advice, we can do all the things that we normally want to do to help our buyers out. Second option would be an agreement to work with a buyer as a customer, which we'll look at here in just a second. Remember that in a customer relationship, we are basically just secretarial. We are only doing the administrative, ministerial acts. We can fill out paperwork for our buyers. We can still show property. We just can't really give any kind of advice. We can't tell them, oh, well, you should probably look at getting a home inspection. So it's a little bit different with that one, a little bit less that we can actually jump in on for our buyers. And then your third option would be a showing agreement. Now, a showing agreement does not give you any kind of client relationship, any kind of customer relationship. That only allows you to be able to go out and show property to that buyer. And when I say show property, that means we're opening the door, we let somebody strolling through. We're like, yo, this is the living room. This is the backyard. Here's the kitchen. Check it out. That's it. We're not actually giving them advice. We're not telling them all the things that we could go into if we were working with them as a client. So let's talk about the paperwork and what it takes to get started with that. Again, this is called the Exclusive Buyer Brokerage Agreement. We're looking at the 2026 version of the forms. And starting out, Section 1 is just saying that this establishes a relationship between the buyer and the agent to work together as agent and client. Section 2 is talking about the term of this agreement. And the term can be whatever time period that you and the buyer agree to. So it can be for a year, it can be for 6 months, it can be for 30 days, it can be for a week. Whatever you guys agree to, but we do need to plug dates into this. So today is March the 2nd. If I was filling this out today, I'd be putting in March 2nd, 2026. And I normally shoot for 6 months when I'm going to fill out these agreements. That gives you ample time normally to help buyers figure out where they want to be at. Now, in the event that you have somebody who is looking for a unicorn or a very, specific property, and it may take you a little bit longer, maybe you do want to go ahead and push this out to a year, but 6 months, probably a good starting point. So if we were looking at doing that, I'd go ahead and push this out to September 30th, 2026. Now, why did I put September 30th and not September 2nd? I like putting the end of the term through the end of the month. That way, it's easier to remember all the different stuff with it. You don't have to go back and be like, oh, what was the random day that this is supposed to end on? So that if you get to that point, you either have to do an amendment to extend it, or you may just have the agreement terminate and then you write a new one. I just always plug it in for the end of the month, just to keep things simple. Section 3, we're going to move on into agency and brokerage. And this is asking what types of agency relationships are not offered by the broker. So I'm here at Keller Williams Lanier Partners. I'm going to go through this section as our office does. If you happen to be watching this video and you're with a different brokerage, make sure you check yourself before you wreck yourself and see what types of agency relationships that your brokerage does or does not offer. So with us at Lanier Partners, we offer everything on here with the exception of sub-agency. Now, what is sub-agency? Sub-agency is essentially where everybody works for the seller. So you have an agent who is actually representing the seller, and then you have a sub-agent who is, again, working for the seller, but they take care of actually writing the forms up for the buyer. We don't practice that because we believe that buyers should have their own representation. So that's the only one that we don't really dive into. It gets a little complicated. But the rest of these, seller agency, buyer agency, designated dual, tenant, landlord, we provide all the rest of them. So if you're looking for any of those services and you don't happen to be an agent watching this, hit us up. We'd love to help you. Part B is rolling on into dual agency. So Part B is where your buyer is going to either consent or not consent to you working in a dual agency capacity. So what is dual agency? Dual agency is where both sides of the transaction are represented by one single agent. So if I was practicing dual agency, I would have Mr. Buyer and Ms. Seller, and I'm working with both of them as clients, and it's only me. doing all the paperwork, all the negotiations, all the things. So let's talk through pros and cons of dual agency, okay? Dual agency, the pros, you make more money, okay? Let's just call it like it is. Typically, if you're working both sides, you are getting more compensation, all right? That's the pro. The end, okay? Cons. Let's talk about the cons. When it comes to dual agency, you are responsible for negotiating between two parties where you know everything about that seller and you know everything about that buyer. That is a very hard situation to be in and not show some type of favoritism or not lean one direction or the other. So that is very complicated. You also have two sets of paperwork that you are juggling the whole entire time. So you're writing up basically two contracts because you're writing it up for the buyer's offer, you're presenting it to the seller, you may be writing a counter offer for the seller back to the buyer. There's a lot of back and forth. And when we're going through and working in a client relationship with our people, it's very important that we keep their best interests at heart. So if I know that my seller has this property listed for, let's say, $500,000, but I know they're willing to take $475,000, and I've got my buyer, and I know that my buyer is pre-approved to offer up to $500,000, but they really want to offer like $480,000. You know, it's hard. It's hard to like work all of it out. So I personally hate dual agency. You guys do you. Work as you see fit. You're an independent contractor. I just think that there is a lot of liability that can come into this. I think that there is a lot of hot water that you can get into very easily. And to me, it is not worth it because if you have a situation where, let's say you've already got that seller, you've got the listing, and a buyer comes along who is unrepresented, guess what? We can refer that buyer to another agent and work out a referral agreement where we're still getting some compensation from that side of the deal, but we avoid the whole entire headache, the process, the mess, all the different things. So new agents, I feel like it's very dangerous for you guys to practice dual agency, even experienced agents. We've had agents that I know of that have been in this business for many years. And if one party feels like they're not treated fairly, it can get real hot real quick. So all that to say, Part B is talking about whether or not your buyer is going to consent to you acting in the dual agency capacity or not. Make sure that you explain that thoroughly, and it is your buyer's choice. Remember that as we're going through these documents, it's all our clients' decisions at the end of the day. We, of course, are going to give advice. We're going to suggest what they do or don't do, or what they agree to or what they don't agree to. But at the end of the day, it's totally up to the buyer as to what they're willing to sign off on. So for me, I check does not on dual agency. You do you. All right, moving on into compensation. So Section 4 is talking all about how we get paid as the agents in the transaction, and it starts off saying that compensation is negotiable and is not set by law. Compensation is totally between you and your client, in this case, your buyer. So whatever you guys work out that you agree to, that's great. And we have a few different options on how we can do it. You can do it as a percentage of the sales price. You can do a flat dollar amount. Or you have Part 3, which is this other section. Before we dive further into that, just to cover Part B, this is just saying that the buyer agrees to pay the broker the compensation set forth below. So it's important that we explain to our buyers that it's not guaranteed that the seller is going to cover the buyer agent compensation. In today's world, it is more negotiable than ever, which is great. It's always been negotiable, but we see this as a point that comes up a lot of times in contracts. So just make sure that when you are going over all this with your buyer, that your buyer understands that whatever you end up putting in Section C right here, they are going to be responsible for paying that. We, of course, can do our best to get that covered by the seller if our buyer directs us to, and yet we want to make sure that the buyer understands that this is going to be a fee that they're responsible for at the end of the day. So, as I said, 3 options. They can do a percentage of the sales price, they can do a flat dollar amount, or we have this other option. Now, we don't really love the other option because that is where we get creative. And we, as real estate agents, as much as we sometimes think that we are not attorneys. We are not lawyers. We did not go to law school. We did not write the forms. So when we start filling things in or thinking outside the box, it can get a little iffy, a little dicey in there every once in a while. And I prefer not to live too close to the edge. So in most situations, you should be able to roll with option 1 or option 2. So let's just say if you're going with option 1, let's say that you and your buyer agree to work for 2%. You would fill in 2, 2, and you're good to go. If it's a different amount, that's cool. It's up to you. Totally negotiable. If you say, hey, I'm going to work for a flat dollar amount and you're going to pay me $5,000 to represent you as a buyer, great. We can plug that in. It's whatever you guys work out. So just roll through, talk it out, see what you guys want to agree to. Also, make sure that you have your value proposition built out. And we're not going to get into value proposition in this session. I'm sure we probably will in a future one. So just check back on the YouTube channel to see what's up with that. But it's important that you do have that value proposition built out so that when you go to ask for this money, you can actually justify what you're asking for. Then we get to Part D. This talks about the possible payment of compensation by the seller or the seller's broker. So this is where the buyer either directs or does not direct you to seek to get the seller or the seller's broker to pay the compensation set forth above. A lot of times our buyers, especially, depending on price points, budget, what they've got going on, a lot of times I feel like our buyer is going to direct us to go after that compensation, to want to get that covered by the seller. But again, everything is negotiable. It's totally up to them. So if they want you to try to get it covered by the seller, you're going to check directs. But if you happen to be working with somebody and they say, you know what, Dylan, man, I just love you, and it doesn't matter what the seller's paying or what they're not paying, I want to pay your compensation. So forget whatever the house is worth. I'm going to cover that compensation out of my pocket. You just worry about giving me the best deal. Cool. If you roll that way, then we would check this does not option and you'd be good to go. So either way, talk through it with your buyers. Disclosure regarding broker's compensation. The buyer shall be obligated to pay all broker compensation not paid by the seller or the seller's broker. So what that's saying is, back up here, let's do a different example, and let's say that we're getting 3% covered in compensation, okay? We ask for 3% to be paid by our buyer. Our buyer directs us to go after it from the seller. And let's say that we can only get the seller to agree to pay us 2%. In that situation, your buyer is on the hook for that additional percent of the sales price. So they would have to bring that to the closing table on top of their other closing costs and fees that may be associated. So just make sure that your buyer does understand that whatever they're signing off on, they would be responsible for either the full amount or making up the difference of that amount in the event that the seller doesn't cover all of it. Then you have a separate compensation on lease. So if you have a situation where you're working with a buyer who says, hey, we may want to rent, we may want to buy, we're not 100% sure, this is where that would come into play. So if they ended up going the lease option, let's just say that they say we can do a lease of up to $2,000 a month. And let's say that you guys talk it out and you decide I'm going to work for $2,000 because that's 1 month's rent and you can just pay me 1 month's rent for helping you get into a lease situation. In that event, we would plug in $2,000 right here and we would put upon execution of the lease. That's if they say we may want to rent, we may want to buy. If they say, Dylan, we ain't renting nothing. The only thing we want to do is buy. That's the only option that we got. We're not interested in any leases of any sort. In that case, I just plug in some NAs right here and we would just say that this part is not applicable. Then we move on into Part G, which is your protected period. So the protected period is the time in which you could argue that you are entitled to compensation. The way that Seth Wiseman explains this, which is the man who writes the contracts for the state of Georgia, Seth says that you should put however long it would take for you to not be mad that your buyer went and bought something without you, essentially. So I normally put 90 days in here on this. Some agents do 180, some agents do 365. So, whatever your tolerance level is, that works for us. But basically, this is just going to be the time period where at the end of the term, so let's say that you get to September 30th, all right, and your buyer hasn't purchased anything, they haven't found the right home, this agreement ends. And then on October 1st, your person goes to one of the houses that you showed them and they try to go directly to the seller and they're like, hey man, we really want to buy this house, but we don't want to pay our agent. Can we just work something out between the two of us? If I showed that house and it's within that protected period after this agreement has ended, I could argue that I'm still owed that compensation on there. Now, in the real world, you're going to have some attorneys probably have to come into play. It may not be worth it to go after that compensation, and yet it's an option. It's something that you can do. It helps protect the compensation that you may be owed. Now, in the event that you get to the end of this term, so September 30th rolls around, and then on October 1st, that buyer goes and starts working with a different agent and signs a new brokerage agreement, you out. The end at that point. Once the new agreement's been signed, that protected period comes to an end. So That's covering Part G. And then compensation on assignment. So if you have a buyer that ends up with the ability to assign a purchase and sale agreement, so they go under contract on a property and they say, hey, we decided we're not going to buy this, but my sister now wants to buy it, so I'm going to assign this contract to my sister. That's cool. They can do that. Sister still is going to owe that compensation to the buyer's agent for getting them through the process. So that's what Section H is talking about. Then you have further explanations. So page 1, the beautiful thing about GAR contracts is that everything is covered pretty much on the first page that you need to fill out. And then there's a corresponding paragraph for each section that goes a little bit deeper. So this explains the brokerage agreement in more depth. This goes through what the term is. Then we get into a lot of stuff about agency and brokerage. So the important thing to note about this is that if you are going to check the allows box up here, so if we say that the buyer does consent to dual agency, I would highly, highly recommend throwing an initial right here, just so that we got total clarification that your buyer understands what's going on with this whole dual agency situation. So that if you happen to have a listing and you also have a buyer that wants the listing that you have, you're working both sides, you write all of it up. This explains in depth what that looks like, and we want to make sure our buyers totally understand that. Then it talks about designated agency. Designated agency just means that both agents work under the same brokerage. So I work with Keller Williams Lanier Partners. If I'm representing a buyer and another agent at our office has the listing and they also work with Keller Williams Lanier Partners, we are designated agents because we are under the same brokerage. We report to the same broker, and yet we're each individually representing different sides of the transaction. So that's your designated agency. Section 4 walks through compensation in a lot more depth as to how that is to work. It explains the protected period in a bit more depth. Then you get into the duties of the broker. So this is what the broker owes to the buyer: to make all disclosures required by law, attempt to locate properties that's suitable for the buyer to purchase, comply with all applicable laws, and assist to the extent requested in negotiating terms of the contract. Buyer's duty. So this is what the buyer owes to us as the agent. Buyer is agreeing to be reasonably available to see property, timely respond to all communication, provide the broker with accurate and complete information, inspect the property. So Georgia is a buyer beware state. It is very important that buyers understand that it is up to them to go deep in the inspections and figure out all the things about the property. Carefully read the terms of the disclosures, work exclusively with the broker, disclose to the broker if they have worked with any other real estate broker, and not contact or see a property listed for sale by owner. So if they do happen to be driving about and they see a for sale by owner property they're interested in, they need to reach out to us as the agent, let us contact that seller and kind of get that going if that's the route they want to go. Broker's authority and responsibility. So the buyer acknowledges and agrees that the broker may show properties in which the buyer is interested, shall have no duty to inspect the property or advise the buyer on any hazardous conditions. So of course, as we're walking through, as agents, if we happen to see something and we're working with you as a client and we're like, oh, that looks like that's jacked up, or oh, we might want to get that looked at, of course, we're going to mention that, but we're not home inspectors. So we're not going to be able to give you a rundown at the same level as actual home inspection would be. So again, Georgia is a buyer beware state. Highly, highly recommend taking time to get a home inspection during your due diligence period to make sure that you know all the things that's going on with the house before we get too far along into the process. They shall owe no duties to the buyer or have authority on behalf of the buyer other than what's set forth in the agreement, and shall not be responsible for ensuring that the buyer complies with duties and deadlines. So we will do our best to remind you and keep you up to date on deadlines, and yet as a buyer, you're going to have to kind of keep things rolling on down the tracks and make sure that everything's happening as well. It shall be held harmless by the buyer during and after the termination of this agreement from any inaccurate information, earnest money handled by anyone other than the brokerage, any injured persons or loss or damage to property, or a buyer's negligence or intentional wrongdoing. So lots of legal jargon covered in here, just covering everybody that's involved, limit on the broker's liability. So again, this just acknowledges that the broker shall under no circumstances have any liability greater than the compensation paid here under to the broker. So basically what that means is that if we were to go through a closing and a buyer isn't happy and they choose to take legal action against the broker, they can only sue for the amount of the compensation, is what that's essentially saying. Disclosures are covered right here. Disclosure, potentially fraudulent activity. So if we're working with a buyer and we see that they're doing something that's kind of sketch, we got to report that. So let's make sure that we're doing things by the book. And then it gets into miscellaneous things. So how arbitration would work, the assignability of contracts, definition of terms, all that fun stuff is broken out right here. And you should take time to go through and actually read all of this line by line. For the sake of this session, my goal is to help you understand how to explain it and to cover the high points. And if you happen to be watching this as a buyer, this is going to give you a quick rundown of the forms, but make sure you reach out to us and we would go much further in depth with you to make sure you feel good about this. Part 8 talks about buyer default. So if the buyer were to default, here's what happens. So the buyer would agree to immediately pay the broker its compensation, and then it just kind of breaks that down further as to how that can happen, what happens if a contract is terminated, all the things. And then it gives some warnings at the end. Cyber fraud is running rampant in our industry. So one of the big things about this is that when it comes to things like wiring instructions, those are only going to be sent once, and they normally are going to come directly from your attorney. Or if it's instructions for holding the earnest money, it's going to come directly from the holder. Again, should just be one email. Those instructions are not going to change. So if you get a secondary email that's like, hey, we are now switching to a different account. This is where we would like for you to send funds to. Run. It's a scam. So just make sure that you're being very careful. Read all the things, check email addresses, and if you ever get something and you feel like, this is kind of fishy, you probably want to reach out to your agent and send it to them and say like, hey, I just got this. Does this look normal to you? And make sure that you're not getting into any situations there. Also with identity theft, again, very important that we are careful as we're going through this process. We don't want to send any information that doesn't need to be sent. So, try to just make sure that we're only sending the things that are asked for. Make sure that we're sending them directly to the person that needs them. We try to avoid being like an intermediary. So, for example, if you happen to be wiring your earnest money to the holder, me as your agent, I'm not going to get in the middle of that. I'm not going to call the holder and be like, yo, can you send me those wiring instructions? I'm going to send them to my buyer. Because then if something goes wrong, then I'm on the hook. Those kind of things need to be handled directly between whoever is the end game person and whoever is sending the funds over. Just make sure we're careful with that. Section 11 gets into brochures. So in this section, we are going to be sending over the ABCs of agency, the protect yourself when buying real property, the what buyers should know about flood hazards, and then the rest of these can be on an as-needed basis. So for our office at Lanier Partners, those 3, every single time, they're going to get sent over. If you're working with a buyer and they say, hey, we really want a historic property, may not be a bad idea to go ahead and send a lead-based paint pamphlet. If you're working with a buyer and they say, hey, we had a mold issue at one of the houses that we had, and we're really terrified about that, maybe you send a mold pamphlet over. Same deal with radon. If you have a buyer that says, we really want to be in an HOA, then you've got what to consider when buying real property in a community association. If you've got somebody who wants a condo, here's what to know about buying a condo. If they want to do new construction, here's what to know about new construction. If they are interested in short sales or distressed properties, here's all the information about that. What to know about buying agricultural land near military bases, installations, and airports. This is a newer form, I think, that came out in 2025. I want to say it could have been 2024, but I think it was 2025. Mainly talking about if you are not a U.S. citizen and you are purchasing land near a military base or airport, there are certain restrictions and things that come into play with that. So if you run into that situation, there's a whole brochure that explains to your consumer, client, customer what's going on with that situation. And then you also have a retainer fee exhibit. So if you're going through this and you as a business owner are choosing to charge a retainer fee for your services as an agent, we do have a form that is ready to go where you can just plug that information in and send on over with this. Then you have a box for special stipulations. So in contracts, special stipulations are for anything specific that's not already covered in the form. In my opinion, it's rare that we really need a special stipulation in brokerage agreements. So when you're writing out the exclusive buyer brokerage or when you're writing out your listing agreement, it's rare that you're going to really need a special stipulation because the forms are so thorough. And if we were to put something in this box that is already pre-written, whatever is written here trumps the pre-written information. So like if I'm up here and let's say that I write a special stipulation in here about cyber fraud, have no clue why I would ever do that. But let's just roll with it since it's at the top of the page. If I write something about cyber fraud right here, that trumps whatever is written out right here in section 9 and could strip me of some of my protections as a real estate agent. So we would prefer to not rewrite anything because, again, we are not attorneys. However, if you do have something that you feel like needs to be addressed and spelled out and agreed upon, this would be the box where you could write it. I would highly encourage you to consult your broker or your coach to help you write anything in that box if you feel the need to do that. And we also have a list of pre-written special stipulations that you can also get access to through the Georgia Association of Realtors that would probably cover 99% of most issues you may need to address in there. Then we're on the last page. So this is your buyer acceptance and contact information. It is important that we get all information plugged in for our buyers with this. So we want to make sure that we get their name, their address, phone number, and their email. The reason that we want all three is that in the event that you start going through the process and you get somebody under contract and then all of a sudden they stop responding to you, we as a brokerage want to be able to prove that we sent certified mail to their mailing address, that we contacted them through phone, and that we also emailed. So it's important that we get all three across the board to make sure every box gets filled in on this. And then you have your brokerage info. Mine's already pre-populated in here. So Keller Williams Lanier Partners is the brokerage we work with. Dylan Duke, there's my phone number. Call me if you're looking to buy or sell real estate. There's my email address, my license number. EOR is the board that I'm a part of, so that's Hall County Board of Realtors. You normally can abbreviate whatever board that you're looking at. So if you're up here in North Georgia, Hall County Board of Realtors is a popular one. We also have Georgia Mountain and Lakes Real Estate Association, which would be GMLRA. 400 North is another board in our area, so you can just put 400 in. And then we also have NAMAR is another big one. So whatever board that you're a part of, go ahead and plug that in right there. Depending on your brokerage, you should have an MLS office code. With us, that is KWRH01 if you're working out of our Gainesville location. If you are based out of our Demarest office or out of our Clayton location, you're going to have KWRH02. So just make sure we plug in the right numbers there. Brokerage license number for us, that's H-44438. Then you've got broker's phone number, fax number, and address listed out right here. And then once everybody has signed, you will also fill in this receipt of copy date. So if you happen to be sending this electronically through DocuSign or Lone Wolf or Transaction Desk, we can go ahead and put a text box in. As long as you're going to be the last person to sign as the agent, you can go ahead and wrap that up and make that easy for you. If you are going to take this to be wet signed, I would strongly encourage you to take 2 copies. Actually take 3 copies, because if you're like me, you're probably going to mess something up on one of them. So take you 3 copies. So if you mark the wrong thing or you sign in the wrong place or your buyer accidentally initials the wrong thing, don't sweat it. You got it back up and you've got one to give to your buyer. And that is how we fill out the buyer brokerage agreement. So that's just the quick rundown. Wanted to give something for the 2026 forms that you guys can come back and reference as needed. A couple other quick things I just wanted to point out while we're on here. ABCs of agency. So this is one of the consumer brochures that we always send out to our clients. So again, this just explains agency relationships in a lot more depth. We would want to have a buyer initial up here at the top and down here at the bottom of the second page just to prove that they got that information. And it just walks them through, seller agency, buyer agency, designated agency, dual agency, a lot of the topics that we just brought up. So just make sure that you plug that one in. We also have the protect yourself when buying real property or when buying a home. This just walks your buyers through a couple of things that they'll want to consider, such as home inspections, more things about cybersecurity, the importance of investigating the property in the neighborhood. So all the different things that come into play with this. So just some good points to bring up to your buyers. And we would, again, have them initial somewhere up here at the top of the page and somewhere down here at the bottom of the last page, just as proof that our buyers received that. And then we also have what buyers should know about flood hazards and floods insurance. Up here in North Georgia, we got lots of hills and lots of valleys. And so we have multiple areas that do touch on flood zones. So we want to make sure that we cover ourselves with that. So we also get our buyers to initial up here at the top of page 1 and then down here at the bottom of page 2. And like I said, there are plenty of other consumer brochures that are listed out on that brokerage agreement that you can include if you see fit with all of it. One other one for our office specifically, while I'm rolling through this, is our affiliate disclosure. This is just letting your buyers know what businesses that partner with us. So if they choose to use McMichael and Gray, with our office, McMichael & Gray is a preferred partner. We actually partnered with them on the title company that they run everything through. So this is just letting them know that some of our agents and staff are partial owners of the title company, and it also breaks down the fees if they choose to use McMichael & Gray. It does not require your buyers to use them in any way, shape, or form. It's just giving that disclosure up front. And then on page 2, we have a list of our other vendors that we partner with. Again, it does not require your buyers to use anybody on here. Tell them not to freak out. They don't have to get 47 home inspections just because we have multiple home inspectors listed on here. It's just letting them know that these are companies that we know do a great job and that they may want to tap into. So we would get them to sign on both pages of this. And keep in mind that when you're representing the buyer, if you do choose to use McMichael & Gray as your closing attorney with Lanier Partners, we want to make sure that we send this document as an exhibit to the purchase and sale agreement so that the seller can sign off on this as well, because we're going to make sure we get this over to closing attorney so they can wrap everything up on their end and make sure everybody's aware of what's going on. Before we wrap up, one other document that we'll take a look at real quick is the agreement to work with a buyer as a customer. So if you are choosing to work with somebody to, again, just do those ministerial acts, we're only filling out paperwork for them, we can go open a door for them, but we are not actually giving them advice or going as in depth as we would. This is the form we would use for that. So you would just plug in your date up here at the top. Your buyer's name would go in below. Term of the agreement, just like on the brokerage, we're going to put however long we're agreeing to work together as customers. So a lot of times could be 6 months, could be a year, could be 30 days, could be a week, whatever you guys agree to. Compensation laid out the exact same way as it was on the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. So just saying that compensation is negotiable. The buyer agrees to pay the compensation listed below. Here's where we're going to plug in the amount that we're working for, and here's where that buyer will direct or not direct us to go after that compensation from the seller. You also have a protected period. So again, however long it would take for you to not be mad that a client went and bought something without you, it's going to get plugged in right there. And then you get down to brochures. So your customer agreement is a bit shorter than your brokerage agreement, not quite as many blanks that we've got to tackle in this one. Just make sure that you take time to fill out all the different things. And it also breaks down for them all those different sections. So again, protected period, the guard forms, cyber fraud, all the different things. It's all broken down. And then your signature page works the exact same way as it did with the buyer brokerage agreement. So that is everything that you need to know about working with buyers and how to get started with the forms. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Dylan Duke, and you can find me online. You can email me at dduke@kw.com. You can call or text 678-997-5421. And we would love to help you get up and running. I'm our productivity coach here at the office for Keller Williams Lanier Partners. So we'd love to help you grow your business. And if you're looking to buy or sell real estate, can help you with that as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will catch you on the next episode, and make sure to like, subscribe, comment, do all the things, share it with a friend. If you got a buddy in real estate who could use a little bit of help, maybe this will be something that helps them out. And we will have the listing agreements version of this coming soon, along with a few other documents. And don't forget to check out the podcast, Chillin' with Dylan, which you can find on this same channel, where we're interviewing all kinds of different agents and people that are in the real estate business. And there's always a ton of stuff that you can learn from that. So thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great day, and we'll catch you on the next one.